What would make a prince disappear from his own home without warning? Not a vacation, not a photo call, not a carefully worded press release. Just gone. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine waking up in one of the most photographed celebrity enclaves in the world, a place where privacy is bought with money, gates, and silence. Imagine that silence suddenly becoming louder than any headline. No smiling appearances, no staged outings, no reassuring leaks to friendly outlets, just absence. And then imagine, almost simultaneously, a name from one of the darkest scandals of modern history crawling back into public conversation. A name most people hoped would never again trend. A name associated with secrets, power, and whispered accusations that never quite die. Now imagine those two things colliding, because that is the moment we are in. And the question everyone is asking, quietly, nervously, is this: did Prince Harry really abandon Montecito because something from Meghan Markle's past was about to resurface? Or is that too simple, too convenient, too dangerous a narrative to believe? Before you decide, stay with me. Because this story is not about proof. Not yet. It's about timing, behavior, patterns, and the uncomfortable space between denial and exposure. Let's start at the beginning. For years, Montecito was presented as a sanctuary, a final destination, a place of healing, a sun-soaked escape from palace walls and press intrusion. We were told this was where the story finally slowed down, where the drama ended, where the cameras would eventually lose interest. That was the promise. But promises don't always survive pressure. Neighbors noticed it first, or at least, they noticed what wasn't there. The familiar comings and goings stopped. Security patterns shifted. The usual quiet hum of activity behind high hedges went unnervingly still. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't announced. It was subtle, and subtle changes are often the most revealing. Then came the whispers. Was he traveling? Was it business? Was it personal? And then came the more dangerous question. Was he running? Because people don't abandon safe havens without a reason. Especially not people whose lives are already defined by scrutiny. Especially not someone who has spent years arguing that privacy is not just a preference, but a necessity. So why now? Why disappear at the exact moment a convicted figure connected to one of the most explosive scandals in history is suddenly being quoted again? Why at the precise moment alleged photos, long rumored but never publicly confirmed, begin circulating in hushed conversations? Coincidence is comforting, but patterns are persuasive. Let's talk about why this story matters right now, and not 5 years ago, not 10. Now, for a long time, certain stories were untouchable. Not because they weren't discussed privately, but because no one wanted to be the one to say them out loud. The legal risks were too high, the social consequences too severe, the evidence too murky. But silence doesn't erase stories. It preserves them. And sometimes, all it takes is one destabilizing voice to make everything shift. Ghislaine Maxwell is not a hero in this narrative. That matters. This is not redemption. This is not truth-telling for the sake of justice. This is something murkier, more unsettling. Because when a deeply compromised source speaks, the world doesn't listen for truth alone. It listens for damage. And damage doesn't require proof. It requires belief. Here's where things get uncomfortable. The public has been trained to think in binaries. Innocent or guilty. Victim or villain. Truth or lie. But real scandals rarely operate that cleanly. Especially scandals involving power, money, and proximity. Because proximity is dangerous. You don't need to be accused of a crime to suffer consequences. You don't need to be proven guilty to lose reputation. Sometimes, all it takes is being in the wrong place, with the wrong people at the wrong time, and having someone else decide to talk. And now, according to circulating claims, that's exactly what's happening. Allegations involving yacht culture. Allegations involving elite social networks. Allegations involving images that, if authentic, could rewrite public perception overnight. Let's be clear. These are allegations. Claims. Stories being discussed, not facts established in court. But that distinction often disappears once narratives take hold. Ask yourself something honestly. If you were a public figure, and someone with nothing left to lose hinted that images from your past might soon be discussed publicly, would you stay put? Or would you get distance? Distance from cameras. Distance from questions. Distance from a house that suddenly feels less like a refuge and more like a stage. Because here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this story. Prince Harry has spent years arguing that the media destroys lives, that relentless coverage fuels mental health crises, that privacy is protection. So why would he leave in a way that invites even more speculation? Unless the speculation was coming anyway. Unless staying was worse than leaving. And that's where the curiosity gap opens. Because when powerful people move suddenly, it's rarely impulsive. It's reactive, strategic, or fearful. Sometimes all three. Now let's talk about Meghan Markle. Carefully, because this is where narratives become weapons. She is one of the most polarizing public figures of the last decade. Loved intensely, criticized relentlessly. Every chapter of her life has been examined, reframed, and argued over. Actress, activist, outsider, duchess, symbol, target. That kind of attention creates two realities, the public one and the private one. And private histories are rarely as neat as public biographies. Hollywood is a place built on reinvention. That's not controversial. It's survival. Careers are shaped by who you know, where you're seen, and which doors you're allowed to walk through. Networking isn't optional. It's oxygen. And that's why yacht culture keeps reappearing in conversations about power. Because yachts are not just luxury. They are moving rooms where rules loosen, where introductions happen away from cameras, where wealthy, influential people gather under the illusion of privacy. This doesn't mean crimes occur on every yacht. It means access occurs, visibility occurs, and visibility can later become liability. So when claims surface suggesting that images exist placing Meghan Markle in proximity to figures now synonymous with scandal, the danger isn't just what those images show. It's what people assume they imply, and assumptions are ruthless. Here's another question for you. Why would someone like Ghislaine Maxwell speak now? Timing is never accidental. People speak when they want leverage, or relevance, or revenge, or narrative control. Sometimes, they speak because silence no longer serves them. And when someone with first-hand access to elite circles speaks, even vaguely, the shockwaves don't need confirmation to begin spreading. They spread because people fill in the gaps themselves. And now, allegedly, those gaps are being filled with imagery. Photos, the most dangerous form of evidence, because they feel definitive even when they aren't. A photo doesn't tell you context. It doesn't tell you intent. It doesn't tell you what happened before or after, but it tells a story people want to believe. And belief is enough to destroy reputations. So if you're Prince Harry, and you've built your post-royal identity around moral clarity, victimhood, and standing on the right side of history, what happens if that clarity is threatened? What happens if your wife's past, fairly or unfairly, is pulled into one of the most radioactive narratives of our time? Do you fight? Do you deny? Or do you disappear before the questions even start? This is why the Montecito exit matters. Not because it proves anything, but because it suggests anticipation. Anticipation of headlines. Anticipation of leaks. Anticipation of conversations that can't be controlled once they begin. And make no mistake, control has always been central to this story. Control of narrative. Control of timing. Control of sympathy. When that control slips, panic follows. We are not at the revelation yet. We are at the tremor before the earthquake. The moment when people start moving pieces quietly, hoping no one notices until it's too late to connect them. But people are noticing, and the silence is starting to feel less like privacy and more like preparation. Because if the allegations grow louder, if more names surface, if more images are hinted at, this story won't remain contained to gossip channels and fringe discussions. It will force a reckoning, not necessarily with truth, but with perception. And perception, once fractured, is nearly impossible to rebuild. So keep this question in your mind as we move forward. Did Prince Harry leave Montecito because he wanted peace? Or because peace was about to become impossible? Because what happened next didn't begin with a photograph. It began with a name being spoken out loud. And once that happened, everything started to unravel. What happens when a neighborhood built on wealth, gates, and discretion suddenly falls silent? That's the question Montecito residents were asking one morning, though no one dared say it out loud. The streets, usually alive with the soft hum of morning routines, jogging bodies, delivery trucks, and the occasional paparazzi stakeout, were unusually still. No luxury SUVs cruising the winding roads. No security personnel pacing visibly outside massive estates. No gardener trimming the sculpted hedges. Just an uncanny quiet, as if someone had muted the soundtrack of normalcy. And at the center of that silence was one home that had, for years, been the subject of whispers, speculation, and fascination. The sprawling Montecito estate belonging to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. It had always been a picture of wealth. Manicured lawns, sweeping driveways, gates that seemed almost ceremonial, walls built to shut out curiosity. Yet this morning, the estate seemed empty. A shell. The kind of emptiness that doesn't happen without reason. Neighbors spoke in whispers to one another, their conversations interrupted by hesitation, glances toward the house, as if fear of being overheard would invite trouble. One resident described it as the strangest calm I've ever felt in Montecito. You could almost hear the tension. No one was saying the obvious, that the occupants might have left, or that something larger was happening behind those gates. The truth, at that point, was still shrouded in conjecture. But behavior, even without explanation, is never neutral. Silence, after all, is a signal. It is often louder than words. In the days leading up to this sudden quiet, subtle changes had been noticed. Security protocols had shifted. Guards were repositioned, cameras adjusted, entrances reinforced. The routine deliveries of groceries, flowers, and organic goods slowed. Staff appearances became intermittent. Even the familiar presence of media-friendly friends, those who might act as unofficial spokespeople, had diminished. Was it preemptive caution? Or something more urgent? The truth is, when public figures vanish without explanation, speculation fills the void. And in Montecito, the void was beginning to echo. Meanwhile, on social media, small but persistent murmurs began to appear. Posts hinted at a sudden absence. Rumors spread, perhaps a family emergency, perhaps a retreat, perhaps business travel. Some whispered about stress, legal pressure, or fear. But the precise cause remained unspoken, creating an electric atmosphere of curiosity and concern. And then came the photographs, or the hints of them. Grainy images, perhaps old, perhaps recent, circulating in closed online circles. Shadows glimpsed at a marina, a yacht, a fleeting glimpse of someone familiar. Nothing confirmed, but enough to ignite speculation and reinforce the sense that Montecito's calm was not normal. Even local media outlets noticed the pattern. Journalists, who had long avoided the estate out of respect for privacy or fear of legal pushback, began quietly asking questions. Reports mentioned unusual activity and unexplained absences. Headlines would come later. But in that moment, only those paying attention could sense the shift. It wasn't just absence. It was timing. Timing that coincided, curiously, with renewed attention toward Ghislaine Maxwell. Her name, long associated with scandal and secrecy, had begun resurfacing in public discourse. And the convergence of these two events, Harry's disappearance and Maxwell's renewed visibility, was impossible to ignore. Consider this. In the world of power, reputation is currency, and threats to it are treated with urgency. People make decisions not solely on evidence, but on the potential perception of evidence. If whispers can reach the public before you can control the narrative, you are already reacting. This is why Montecito going quiet was not a casual event. It was strategic. It was protective. It was anticipatory. But protection has consequences. Removing yourself from sight invites more questions than it silences. Curiosity grows in the absence of answers. Neighbors, journalists, fans, and critics alike began constructing stories, some wildly inaccurate, others frighteningly plausible. And that, in turn, increased the pressure on those behind the gates. Meanwhile, staff members, those closest to the daily operations of the estate, found themselves in delicate positions. Some were instructed to maintain routines superficially, to create the illusion of normalcy when outsiders looked in. Others were told nothing, left to guess what was happening, and inadvertently added to the mystery with their own nervous behaviors. Even within the compound, the atmosphere shifted. A home that had once been described as warm, vibrant, and inviting now seemed tense and silent. Rooms once filled with laughter and conversation were quiet. Lights were dimmed. Windows, previously open to let in the sun and coastal breeze, were shuttered or obscured. This kind of silence is telling. For public figures, every detail is scrutinized. Empty gates, covered windows, absence of cars, all signals that something significant is unfolding. And in the context of Montecito, a location chosen for privacy and peace, the sudden stillness was amplified, not hidden. Yet even as the neighborhood noticed, no one could confirm anything. That uncertainty is what creates tension. People fill in gaps with conjecture, and the stories begin to take on a life of their own. In Montecito, the quiet was fertile ground for narratives, whispers, and anxiety. What made it even more alarming was the context. Just as Harry and Meghan were retreating into silence, whispers of Ghislaine Maxwell's resurfacing claims were spreading. She was speaking, indirectly or through intermediaries, about circles and events long kept in shadows. And the combination of Maxwell's notoriety and the hinted-at images created a pressure cooker environment. This is where human behavior becomes fascinating. When faced with potential exposure, whether real or perceived, people react preemptively. They leave, they withdraw, they hide. They attempt to control a narrative before it controls them. Montecito's silence, then, was more than an absence. It was a statement, a strategy, a defensive maneuver. And the more the neighborhood noticed, the louder it became, even without words. Local security analysts, observing from a distance, noted patterns consistent with high-profile protective measures. Increased surveillance, relocation of vehicles, staggered staff schedules. All of this suggested an acute awareness of risk, not speculative risk, real, imminent, and socially amplified risk. In this environment, rumors become reality. What people imagine often matters more than what is factual. And in Montecito, the line between imagination and reality was collapsing. By midday, the streets had quieted completely. Delivery vans bypassed the estate. Neighbors peeked cautiously from behind fences. Journalists made discreet inquiries. And somewhere inside the sprawling property, decisions were being made that would ripple far beyond the gates. All the while, whispers of photos, yachts, and infamous names loomed like clouds on the horizon. Whether these claims were true or exaggerated mattered less than the perception they created. Perception drives reaction. Reaction drives narrative. And narrative, in the hands of the public, is unstoppable. And so Montecito waited. Its silence, deliberate or inevitable, became the story. The anticipation, the uncertainty, the tension, all of it coalesced into a moment that would set the tone for what followed. But the story was far from over. In fact, this quiet was just the beginning. Because what comes next, when images, names, and revelations collide, will challenge not just public perception, but personal boundaries, loyalty, and the very idea of privacy. And at the center of it all, the question remains, why now? Why Montecito? Why retreat when the world is already watching? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. This was not the first time Prince Harry had walked away. Not from family, not from tradition, not from the media. In fact, stepping away had become something of a pattern, a thread woven throughout his life, a repeated act that the public often interpreted as rebellion, but which insiders might describe as survival. Think about it. The young prince, raised in the glare of cameras and endless scrutiny, was never afforded the ordinary freedoms most of us take for granted. Every misstep, every smile, every glance, every friend chosen or discarded became a public spectacle. Mistakes weren't forgiven, they were broadcast. Success wasn't celebrated, it was questioned. And through it all, the need to assert autonomy, to carve out a space where he could exist as more than a royal figure, was constant. So, when Harry made the decision to leave Montecito, it fit the pattern, but it also felt different. This wasn't just a temporary retreat for privacy or reflection. Something more urgent, more reactive, more charged with fear seemed to be driving him. To understand the magnitude of this, we have to rewind a little. The first notable departure was leaving the armed forces. Military life had given Harry structure, purpose, and a sense of accomplishment. He thrived in environments where merit mattered more than birthright. But after years of service, he stepped away. Not because he wanted to quit, but because his personal life collided violently with public expectation. The media coverage of his relationships, the constant scrutiny, and the invasive focus on every decision made him leave a world he loved in order to protect himself. Then came his departure from the royal family. The decision to step back from royal duties alongside Meghan Markle was framed publicly as a pursuit of independence. Yet behind the headlines and viral photographs, it was a culmination of years of tension, alienation, and a desire to escape constant judgment. The palace, for all its pomp and tradition, had become suffocating. And when one exists in an environment that simultaneously demands perfection and punishes imperfection, leaving is often the only way to reclaim agency. But the pattern is more subtle than just leave when pressure mounts. The timing, the way exits are executed, and the signals sent all tell a story. Harry's departures were never abrupt in the emotional sense. They were premeditated, carefully staged, yet communicated through behavior rather than announcements. He leaves through silence, through absence, through the careful orchestration of perception. Now, in Montecito, history seemed to repeat itself. The sudden disappearance mirrored previous exits. A home left empty, staff instructed in precise routines, public silence, a few carefully controlled appearances, or none at all. The difference? This time, it wasn't a palace, an army base, or even a tabloid frenzy that prompted his movement. This time, the threat came from shadows of the past, whispers of images, resurfacing names, and a looming scandal capable of reigniting media firestorms. The psychological impact of repeated scrutiny cannot be overstated. Living under a microscope warps perception, heightens anxiety, and distorts judgment. Harry had grown up with cameras in his face, criticism in his ear, and public opinion as a constant companion. Every misstep was not just a private failure. It became a national or global spectacle. It's one thing to make a mistake in private. It's another when millions dissect every moment. So when he leaves Montecito, it's not merely physical. It's psychological. It is an assertion, I will not be trapped. I will not be reduced to what others say about me. And yet, that freedom comes with its own cost. Because leaving in silence invites speculation, and speculation has its own life, often more damaging than the reality. There's also the emotional weight of loyalty. Harry's exit decisions have rarely been selfish in the conventional sense. They often reflect attempts to protect those closest to him. In leaving Montecito, one could argue that his primary goal was to shield Meghan, and potentially their children, from immediate exposure to a narrative they could not control. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were personal. And that is where tension builds in this story. Because the closer the threat becomes, the more reactive human behavior tends to be. Withdrawal is a natural defense. But withdrawal also creates a vacuum. And vacuums, especially in high-profile scenarios, are filled quickly by reporters, neighbors, social media, and rumor mills. Which leads us to another crucial point, the optics of departure. In Harry's previous exits, the optics were as meticulously managed as the act itself. Leaving the military was framed around service and self-actualization. Stepping back from the royal family was couched in autonomy, fairness, and family well-being. But disappearing from Montecito suddenly, without explanation, carries ambiguity, and ambiguity fuels speculation. And speculation, in turn, can be dangerous. It gives narratives life before facts have a chance to settle. It allows stories to grow, mutate, and take on momentum beyond the control of those involved. Harry understood this implicitly, yet the move suggests that the risk of staying outweighed the risk of absence. Another layer to consider is the timing relative to media cycles. Public interest in Harry and Meghan does not ebb entirely. Even during periods of seeming calm, outlets and social platforms track, dissect, and amplify any hint of movement. A sudden absence, then, becomes a story in itself. And stories about absence are uniquely powerful. They suggest mystery, tension, and sometimes crisis. We also have to examine the personal consequences. Every public figure experiences stress differently, but Harry's past trauma, personal losses, and lifelong scrutiny mean that perceived threats trigger intense responses. Retreating is not just a tactical choice, it is an emotional necessity. The neighborhood in Montecito began to notice patterns that weren't normal. Car rotations slowed. Deliveries were irregular. Staff were quieter, more careful. And while on the surface, these could be interpreted as minor operational adjustments, context gives them significance. Context tells us that people do not alter routines unless something is shifting beneath the surface. Even as these small signs mounted, insiders speculate that the decision to leave was compounded by warnings, informal or formal, about media or social fallout. When reputations are at stake, preemptive moves are as much about avoidance as protection. And in this case, the avoidance was total. Gone. Out of sight. The estate remained as silent as the rumors swirling around it. This is where the human element becomes essential. Imagine the stress of anticipating exposure, navigating past accusations, and trying to shield those you love while being aware that every move you make will be analyzed and possibly weaponized. That is the environment in which this decision was made. And yet, even within this strategic withdrawal, there is tension. Absence invites more questions than presence. Every minute away from public view adds fuel to speculation. People begin connecting dots, some imagined, some inferred. Social media algorithms accelerate this. News outlets chase it. Whispers in elite circles echo into broader narratives. In other words, retreat is not risk-free. But sometimes, it is necessary. And that brings us to the final point about patterns. Harry has consistently acted to protect agency, reputation, and emotional well-being, even if that means leaving environments that are harmful or threatening. Montecito, despite its idyllic appearance, suddenly represented a potential threat to those priorities. So when he left, it was not impulsive. It was informed, deliberate, and reactive. And the signals it sent were unmistakable: a disruption of normalcy, a recalibration of boundaries, and a silent acknowledgement that something had shifted. Something urgent, something consequential. But the tension does not end with absence. Because when powerful people vanish, the world does not stop watching. The gaps they leave are filled with stories, interpretations, and speculation, often more dramatic than the reality. And in Harry's case, the absence would soon intersect with forces from Meghan's past, threatening to amplify that speculation into something uncontainable. Which leads us to the critical question at the heart of this chapter. When a prince repeatedly walks away, is it rebellion, survival, fear, or a combination of all three? Because what came next would test not just his instincts, but the very limits of control in a world where privacy is a myth and perception is reality. Some names never leave the conversation. They linger in whispers, resurface in rumors, and refuse to fade even after years behind bars, headlines, and legal documents. One such name is Ghislaine Maxwell. To most people, she is a figure associated with darkness, scandal, and the hidden corners of elite social networks. Her notoriety is not accidental. It is a byproduct of proximity, secrecy, and allegations so explosive that even decades later, they continue to reverberate. And when her name emerges, it carries weight, not because of what she has said recently, but because of everything she represents. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, the sudden reappearance of Maxwell's name in conversations tied to alleged yacht images was not just inconvenient. It was destabilizing. Because Maxwell, more than almost anyone, embodies the intersection of power, secrecy, and scandal. She is a person whose narrative can amplify the smallest detail into a public sensation. Let's pause and consider the power of association. Being mentioned in proximity to her, even in passing, is dangerous. Because public perception rarely waits for verification. Once a connection is insinuated, assumptions follow. And assumptions, as we have seen repeatedly, can be more destructive than evidence. Maxwell's history, widely reported, has created a unique dynamic. For those unfamiliar, she was intimately tied to Jeffrey Epstein, the financier whose social network included some of the most powerful and influential figures of the past few decades. Allegations against him spanned decades, involving exploitation, trafficking, and manipulation of vulnerable individuals. Maxwell's role, according to both victims and legal authorities, was central in coordinating, managing, or facilitating aspects of these activities. When Maxwell speaks, even indirectly, the ripple effect is enormous. Her credibility may be contested, but her capacity to generate fear, speculation, and narrative momentum is undeniable. In the world of high-profile reputations, that's enough to cause preemptive reactions. Now, consider this. A prince who has spent a lifetime avoiding public scandal, protecting family, and managing his image is suddenly faced with a renewed connection, alleged or implied, to someone like Maxwell. The stakes are immediate. Not only does he have to consider how this affects him, but also his spouse, his children, and their shared public identity. For years, the public narrative of Harry and Meghan has been tightly controlled. Carefully curated appearances, selective interviews, and strategic public statements have painted them as independent, forward-thinking, and moral arbiters of their own lives. And yet, narratives are fragile. One whispered allegation, one resurfaced name, one image, real or rumored, can unravel years of carefully constructed identity. That is why Maxwell's name matters so profoundly. It is not about her alone. It is about the associations she represents, the shadows she casts, and the questions that automatically follow when her name enters any conversation. Imagine the psychological weight of knowing that an indirect connection, real, rumored, or suggested, could ignite global scrutiny overnight. For a public figure, the anticipation of exposure can feel more urgent than exposure itself. Anxiety builds. Decisions are made preemptively. Movements are calculated. Silence becomes both shield and strategy. And Maxwell's name carries another layer of danger, timing. She speaks, or hints, or allows information to leak, not at random, but when it will have maximum effect. The timing suggests calculation. It suggests an understanding of the mechanics of reputation, media attention, and the fragility of public perception. For Harry and Meghan, this timing could not have been worse. Because they were already navigating a complex landscape of public expectation, private protection, and personal well-being. A sudden, high-profile association, even a hint of connection, to Maxwell could trigger cascading consequences. Legal, reputational, and emotional risks all compound. This is not idle speculation. History offers multiple examples of public figures whose lives were disrupted by mere insinuation or association. In high-profile circles, proximity alone can be dangerous. Being photographed in the wrong place at the wrong time, attending the wrong party, or even being mentioned in passing can shift public perception dramatically. And that is exactly what Maxwell represents, the danger of proximity. The risk that even indirect or unproven associations become narratives the public wants to believe. Once that happens, controlling the narrative becomes nearly impossible. For Prince Harry, understanding this dynamic is critical. Every move, every decision, every withdrawal must be viewed through the lens of risk management. It is why disappearing from Montecito suddenly makes sense. The estate is supposed to be a sanctuary, but when potential scandal looms, proximity, physical or perceived, becomes a liability. We also need to consider the historical pattern of high-profile exits in response to perceived threat. Royals, celebrities, and politicians alike have repeatedly used absence as a protective measure. By physically removing themselves from potential exposure, they attempt to create distance between speculation and reality. But absence comes at a cost. It signals vulnerability. It invites scrutiny. It creates the very narrative they hope to avoid. And in this case, the narrative was unavoidable. Maxwell's reemergence had set the stage. Alleged yacht images, whispered associations, and renewed public interest were converging. Montecito's quiet was not a random pause. It was a response to a rising storm. But Maxwell's influence extends beyond timing. Her name carries emotional weight, both for the public and for those indirectly implicated. Fear, guilt, suspicion, and defensive behavior are natural reactions. Even if the connection is tenuous, the perception is real. The psychological impact on Harry, Meghan, and their team cannot be overstated. This is why the narrative is so compelling. It is not about proven connections. It is about the anticipation of exposure, the anticipation of public judgment, and the anticipation of consequences. And anticipation, in these contexts, often drives action faster than reality itself. Here is the uncomfortable truth. In high-stakes scenarios, perception often outweighs fact. The public does not wait for courts or evidence. Social media accelerates belief. Headlines amplify insinuation. And by the time clarity is possible, reputational damage is already done. So, Maxwell's name is not just a historical reference. It is a trigger, a catalyst, a reminder that, in a world of elite networks, one whispered name can change behavior, force decisions, and reshape narratives. And as Harry's absence in Montecito shows, reactions are immediate. When you know the storm is coming, you either prepare or flee. And in this case, the choice seemed clear: retreat, even if temporarily, to gain control, privacy, and perspective. But the danger is far from over. Because Maxwell's influence is not just historical. It is present. It is active. And when the public begins to connect dots, some real, some imagined, the pressure escalates exponentially. For those watching from outside, it may appear as a simple story of retreat. But for those living it, it is a complex calculus of risk, perception, loyalty, and survival. And that is the paradox of proximity, influence, and reputation. The closer you are to power, the more fragile your privacy becomes. And the more fragile your privacy, the more urgent every decision feels. So, the question we are left with is stark. What happens when the name that never disappears resurfaces at the exact moment you need control most? Because what came next would force decisions that could not be reversed, and no one was ready for the fallout. What happens in a world where money buys privacy, influence, and freedom? A world where the elite gather on floating palaces beyond the reach of cameras, reporters, and casual observers? That world is the realm of luxury yachts, and it's a universe few truly understand. When people hear yacht culture, they imagine sunshine, cocktails, pristine decks, and parties that go on until sunrise. But beneath the glamour lies a shadowed ecosystem, a place where power, secrecy, and discretion intersect. The yachts are more than vessels. They are symbols, fortresses, and sometimes incubators of influence that the public rarely sees. For decades, yachts have been the preferred venue for the world's wealthy and influential. Why? Because on land, every movement can be tracked, photographed, and recorded. Cameras, social media, and gossip make the terrestrial world unforgiving. But at sea, rules are different. You can board a vessel, drop anchor in a secluded cove, and exist for hours, days, or weeks outside the gaze of the masses. And when that world intersects with the elite, including Hollywood, finance, politics, and royalty, privacy isn't just a convenience, it's currency. Being invited onto a yacht is a sign of inclusion, trust, and access. Being excluded signals distance or disfavor. In other words, yachts are the ultimate social barometers. But there's another dimension. Yachts are places where the ordinary rules of accountability often loosen. When a wealthy individual hosts a gathering at sea, legal oversight is minimal. International waters, private contracts, and the ability to control who is on board all create a unique environment. Actions taken here are difficult to monitor, and intentions become nearly impossible to verify. Think of yachts as floating microcosms of elite society. Hierarchies, alliances, and power plays unfold quietly, away from prying eyes. Decisions with consequences for business, reputation, or personal relationships often happen here first. Deals are whispered. Introductions are curated. Invitations are signals. Exclusion is punishment. This is crucial when we start discussing alleged connections between Meghan Markle, Jeffrey Epstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell. It is not just about individuals. It is about context. The environment in which interactions occur matters. On a yacht, the casual observer sees leisure. But insiders understand subtext. Networking, influence, implication. Yacht culture operates on subtle rules. Photos, for example, are rarely taken openly. Guests are expected to maintain discretion. Social media sharing is often forbidden. And yet, even in this carefully managed universe, rumors leak. Whispers become stories. Stories become headlines. And suddenly, images, real, altered, or misinterpreted, can emerge years later with explosive impact. Consider the mechanics. A high-profile figure boards a vessel with powerful individuals. Events occur that are seemingly innocuous. Dinners, excursions, conversations. No one outside witnesses them. But years later, when narratives shift, those moments are revisited, scrutinized, and interpreted in ways never imagined. The casual observer has no context. Yet context matters. It always matters. And for Meghan Markle, the stakes are magnified. As a public figure whose life has been dissected for decades, the line between private and public is constantly blurred. Every alleged encounter, every image, every mention in conversation has the potential to ignite controversy. And when a name like Maxwell reappears in this context, it transforms a private setting into a subject of global speculation. Now, imagine the psychological toll of this world. For someone who values privacy, every invitation, every boarding, every handshake carries weight. Social interactions are never neutral. Every appearance could be documented, interpreted, and weaponized. The luxury is intoxicating, but the scrutiny is relentless. And the fear of implication, whether fair or unfair, looms constantly. This is why Montecito's quiet makes sense. A retreat from the world of visibility, yes, but also a strategic withdrawal from a context where perception is everything. Because the higher the stakes, the less tolerance there is for risk. And in a universe defined by yachts, whispers, and influence, risk is everywhere. Consider, too, the role of imagery. Photographs are among the most potent tools in this environment. They carry undeniable visual evidence, but rarely communicate intent. A smile, a handshake, a shared drink. These become symbols for outsiders who cannot understand context. And when reputations are fragile, these symbols are enough to trigger panic. And yet, this world operates by unspoken rules. Guests are expected to honor discretion, to leave no traces, to trust that what occurs aboard stays aboard. Violations are rare but catastrophic when they occur. For someone in Harry and Meghan's position, even the perception of misstep can feel threatening, especially when names like Maxwell are involved. So, why does yacht culture matter in this story? Because it frames the environment in which allegations arise. It explains why images, rumors, and associations have the power to create panic long after the events themselves. It clarifies why Montecito, normally a sanctuary, suddenly feels unsafe. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Even without wrongdoing, proximity and visibility in elite spaces create risk. Being seen, being photographed, being mentioned, even indirectly, can shift narratives irreversibly. In this world, innocence is not protective, perception is decisive. For Prince Harry, understanding these dynamics is critical. Years of experience with media scrutiny, palace politics, and Hollywood circles have taught him that control is finite and exposure is dangerous. When Maxwell's name resurfaced, tied to alleged images in yacht settings, the implications were immediate. Perceived threat, potential media amplification, and the possibility that a past moment could suddenly redefine the present. This is why the Montecito retreat was more than a pause. It was a calculated response to a universe where perception outweighs fact, where images carry weight, and where whispers can ignite firestorms. It was an acknowledgement that even paradise, when threatened, becomes a prison. But yacht culture is not merely background. It is a character in this story. An invisible force shaping behavior, decisions, and timing. It explains why Harry reacts, why Meghan may feel vulnerable, and why silence can feel safer than confrontation. And yet, the story is far from resolved. Because the more people whisper, the more images circulate, and the more names resurface, the greater the pressure becomes. The world behind the velvet rope is no longer just private. It is a catalyst for public consequences. And in this high-stakes environment, the next moves are critical. Every retreat, every absence, every decision to remain unseen is both defensive and strategic. And even as Montecito went quiet, the forces of rumor, media, and speculation were already closing in. Because what came next would pull the private world of yachts into public discourse, and no one could predict the magnitude of the fallout. Images have power, not just because they capture a moment, but because they imply truth. They freeze time, creating an illusion of certainty in a world that is almost always ambiguous. One photo can confirm suspicion, ignite rumor, or destroy a carefully curated reputation. And in the world of the elite, where visibility is both currency and liability, photographs carry a unique, almost terrifying weight. For Meghan Markle, the alleged yacht photos are precisely this kind of weapon. They are not just pictures, they are potential detonators. Whether authentic, misinterpreted, or completely fabricated. They operate as symbols, visual shorthand for assumptions, judgments, and narratives that can spiral beyond control. Let's be clear, no verified photo has been publicly released as of yet. But in closed circles, whispers of images persist. People claim to have seen glimpses. Some say they have screenshots. Others hint at conversations where the photos were referenced. Even the suggestion of their existence is enough to trigger panic in those concerned about reputation, privacy, and public perception. Why are these photos so potent? First, because they allegedly involve high-profile figures in intimate or private settings. The public rarely sees such moments. They are out of reach, shielded from scrutiny by wealth, power, and discretion. The moment such images surface, or are rumored to exist, they create cognitive dissonance. Fans, critics, and neutral observers alike are forced to reconcile an image they may never see with narratives they already know. Second, context is everything, and context is often missing. A smile on a deck, a handshake, a toast with others, innocent gestures within private settings, can be interpreted as complicity or association by outside audiences. Without understanding the nuances of who was present, what was discussed, or what agreements were made, the public fills the gaps with speculation. And speculation, in a world driven by clicks, likes, and shares, can become more influential than fact. Third, timing magnifies impact. These alleged photos are emerging, or being hinted at a moment of heightened sensitivity. Prince Harry and Meghan have carefully constructed post-royal lives, balancing public appearances with private protection. A sudden resurfacing of past imagery threatens to destabilize this balance, regardless of truth. Consider the psychology behind this. Humans are wired to interpret visual cues as evidence. Seeing a face in a setting linked to scandal triggers immediate judgment, even without additional information. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines, and in high-profile cases, perception often trumps reality. Once an image is known, even if unverifiable, it carries the weight of proof in the public imagination. Now, imagine the fear generated by this knowledge, not just for Harry and Meghan, but for their entire team. Legal advisors, PR specialists, and family members all understand the stakes. Even a hint of association can trigger immediate damage control measures, controlled exits, delays in appearances, and strategic silences. This is likely why Montecito went quiet so suddenly. The alleged yacht photos also create a unique narrative trap. They intersect with names already loaded with historical baggage: Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. These associations amplify the perceived risk exponentially. Even if no wrongdoing occurred, proximity and implication become enough to destabilize reputation. It is a phenomenon often described as guilt by association, though in practice, it is far more destructive because public perception rarely waits for evidence. Another dimension to consider is the leak potential. Images, once shared, even in small circles, cannot be contained. Screenshots, whispers, and social media mentions all propagate in ways that are nearly impossible to control. Each leak increases pressure, heightens anxiety, and makes retreat seem necessary. Montecito's sudden quiet, in this light, becomes an understandable precaution rather than a mysterious disappearance. And yet, there is also a paradox. The more effort taken to suppress these images, the more attention they attract. Humans are naturally drawn to secrets, forbidden knowledge, and hidden narratives. Attempts to control or silence discussion about alleged photos often backfire, fueling curiosity and intensifying public scrutiny. From a storytelling perspective, this is why the images are central. They are not just visual evidence. They are the narrative fulcrum around which all other tension pivots. Alleged photos create a story that is immediate, visceral, and difficult to ignore. They compel attention because humans are drawn to visual confirmation, even in the absence of context or proof. For Prince Harry, the emergence of these alleged images represents a multi-layered threat: reputational, emotional, and strategic. It is not merely about the content of the photographs themselves, but the networks they touch, the whispers they trigger, and the public perception they shape. In high-profile cases, perception is reality, and managing perception is often more urgent than responding to fact. This is where the stakes become almost unbearable. When you are constantly visible, constantly analyzed, and constantly judged, the threat of a single image, real, rumored, or imagined, can feel existential. It is not just privacy at risk, it is identity, credibility, and control. And so the response is calculated: withdrawal, strategic silence, and containment. Montecito's empty streets, silent gates, and dimmed lights are part of a defensive strategy designed to absorb shock before public narrative explodes. But as we know, absence often invites attention, not alleviates it. It is also important to understand the emotional dimension. Images have the power to trigger fear, guilt, anxiety, and defensiveness. For public figures with high exposure, even the suggestion of damaging visuals can disrupt sleep, focus, and judgment. Decisions are made not in calm analysis, but under pressure. This urgency likely drove the rapid disappearance from Montecito. But these images are more than triggers. They are symbols. Symbols of hidden networks, of power, of secrecy, and of influence. They carry meaning beyond what is captured in pixels. And in a world where symbolism can outweigh reality, they become potent weapons. And yet, paradoxically, the uncertainty is equally powerful. When people do not know if the images are real, but believe they might be, the anxiety is magnified. Rumor without proof can be more destabilizing than evidence with context. In other words, ambiguity is as dangerous as revelation. So, these alleged photos are not just pictures. They are catalysts. They are warnings. They are forces that shape behavior, decisions, and movements. Montecito's quiet, Harry's absence, and the strategic withdrawal are all responses to this looming threat. And the tension continues to build. Because while images can never tell the whole story, their perception creates a reality all their own. A reality that will soon collide with media coverage, public speculation, and the inner circle's need to protect reputation at all costs. Which brings us to the question that hangs over this chapter. How do you respond to something that may or may not exist, but carries the weight of potential catastrophe? Because what came next would make even the anticipation of exposure seem small, and no one saw it coming. Silence can be deafening. That's something Prince Harry and his team were learning in Montecito. The quiet that enveloped the estate was not peaceful. It was tense, charged, electric with anticipation. Because when rumors, whispered allegations, and the specter of potentially explosive images converge, silence becomes a battlefield. To understand the panic behind the gates, we need to start with the concept of control. For public figures, control is everything. Control of narrative, control of timing, control of access. Without it, chaos emerges. And in Montecito, control was slipping, or at least, it felt that way. The initial triggers were subtle. Security personnel noticed unusual patterns. A surge of digital chatter hinting at alleged yacht images, small inquiries from journalists probing for details, and unusual social media activity around Meghan Markle's past. The kind of intelligence that rarely reaches the public, but immediately alarms those trained to read risk. Imagine the team's position. Every decision had to be made with precision. Every move outside the estate could be observed, photographed, and interpreted. Every statement, spoken or released, could either calm speculation or fan the flames. The pressure was immediate and relentless. Inside the estate, the atmosphere reflected this tension. Staff were on edge, instructed to maintain routines while projecting normalcy, all while sensing that the usual calm was no longer present. Rooms that were once hubs of activity became quiet spaces of anticipation. Staff whispered. Lights were dimmed. Cars left the driveways irregularly to avoid drawing attention. Every action was scrutinized, internally and externally. This is where human psychology meets high-stakes celebrity life. The anticipation of exposure often triggers behavior more intense than the actual event would. Anxiety multiplies, decisions are made preemptively, and defensive measures escalate rapidly. This is exactly what happened in Montecito. Prince Harry's reaction, although private, was likely calculated. The sudden absence from public view, the minimized interaction with neighbors, the strategic reinforcement of privacy measures. These were all protective mechanisms. But even protection has a cost. Absence generates questions, questions generate speculation, and speculation invites scrutiny. Meanwhile, The media ecosystem was sensing the shift. Reporters noticed patterns, a decrease in visible activity, irregular social media postings, and subtle signals that something was amiss. Even without concrete evidence, their instincts told them this was a story in motion. And the anticipation of a revelation, even a rumored one, is often more newsworthy than the revelation itself. Inside Montecito, advisors were likely managing multiple layers of risk simultaneously: legal, reputational, emotional. Each layer compounds the others. A single misstep could cascade. The perceived threat of the alleged yacht photos, combined with the resurfacing of Maxwell's name, created a perfect storm. The team's decisions reflect this. Strategic silence was prioritized, controlled appearances minimized, communications filtered through trusted channels only. Each decision aimed at preserving the narrative, preventing leaks, and buying time. But there's a paradox in panic. The more you try to control, the more obvious the tension becomes. Silence itself becomes a signal. The empty streets, covered windows, and subtle changes in routine became the story, long before any photos or revelations were confirmed. And the emotional toll was palpable. Panic is not just operational, it is deeply personal. Anxiety affects sleep, decision-making, and interpersonal dynamics. For Harry and Meghan, the stakes were not just reputational, they were familial, relational, and psychological. The potential exposure of images implicating Meghan directly impacts their family, their children, and the lives they've been trying to protect. We also need to consider the broader ecosystem of panic. Friends, advisors, and legal teams all play roles. Their own anxieties influence recommendations. Decisions are made not just on facts, but on perception of threat, urgency, and potential fallout. In this environment, panic spreads like a contagion, affecting behavior across the estate. Then there's the external pressure. Social media, online forums, and speculative reporting amplify the sense of crisis. Even without confirmed images, mentions of alleged yacht photos circulate rapidly. Public perception accelerates the internal sense of urgency. This is why absence, though protective, is also destabilizing. By retreating from public view, Harry signals vulnerability. He becomes a figure to be analyzed, discussed, and speculated about. In high-stakes scenarios, absence is both shield and magnifier, and the psychological impact compounds when considering the stakes of potential leaks. Images, once suggested to exist, cannot be unseen. Allegations, once whispered, cannot be ignored. The tension inside Montecito was as much about what might happen as what had happened. The pattern of panic is also instructive. Rapid defensive measures, silent retreats, and strategic obfuscation are hallmarks of high-profile crises. They indicate recognition of imminent threat. And in this case, the threat is multidimensional: legal exposure, reputational damage, and emotional strain. For the household, every choice became strategic. Movements were minimized. Communication was filtered. Appearances were controlled or canceled. Even mundane decisions, like when to eat, when to walk outdoors, when to answer calls, were weighed against risk. Yet, the paradox remains. The more you retreat, the more speculation thrives. And in celebrity culture, speculation often outpaces facts, becoming a story in itself. This dynamic creates a feedback loop. Absence generates rumor, rumor heightens panic, panic drives further absence. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of Maxwell's reemergence. The threat she represents is not only historical, but immediate. The potential for renewed scrutiny, public interest, and rumor amplification adds layers to the anxiety inside Montecito. For Prince Harry, this is a familiar landscape, but its intensity is magnified. Years of public exposure have trained him to anticipate risk, but the intersection of past associations, alleged images, and timing creates a crisis that cannot be easily mitigated. The panic is both operational and emotional, affecting every decision, every interaction, every move behind the gates. And yet, for the world outside, these subtleties are invisible. Observers see only absence, quiet streets, and shuttered windows. But behind those gates, the tension is palpable, a storm held in temporary containment. This is why Montecito's silence was not just retreat, it was a response to fear. a strategic recalibration, and a recognition that sometimes survival requires temporary withdrawal, even when withdrawal itself invites scrutiny. But the story does not end with silence. Because in high-stakes crises, the calm before the storm is only temporary. The next moment, the next leak, the next rumor can change everything. And for Harry and Meghan, the next wave of pressure was already forming. Because what came next would push Montecito beyond quiet tension into full-blown crisis, and no one could predict how it would unfold. When silence meets speculation, the media fills the void. That is a rule as old as journalism itself, and it was unfolding in Montecito with alarming speed. The estate's sudden quiet, combined with whispered allegations about alleged yacht photos and Maxwell's resurfacing influence, created the perfect environment for a media storm. Journalists thrive on gaps. When public figures disappear, rumors flare, and narratives begin to form almost instantaneously. The absence of facts is irrelevant. What matters is the perception of newsworthiness. Empty gates, dimmed lights, and a quieter-than-usual estate became the signals reporters had been waiting for. Within hours, digital media networks had picked up on the subtle patterns. Twitter feeds lit up with speculation. Instagram posts hinted at absence. YouTube channels began creating content, asking questions, and framing stories in a way that suggested imminent revelations. Even without concrete proof, the narrative momentum accelerated. And in the era of 24/7 media cycles, momentum is more valuable than accuracy. Traditional news outlets followed suit. Though careful to frame reports as unverified or rumored, they highlighted the absence, the alleged connections, and the historic context. Headlines began appearing: Montecito and mystery. Where are Harry and Meghan? Alleged yacht photos raise questions about Markle past. Even with disclaimers, the public received the impression that something significant was unfolding. The psychology behind this is fascinating. Humans are drawn to unresolved tension. Empty streets and silent estates provoke curiosity. Suggested danger provokes urgency. And the combination of mystery plus high-profile figures creates a nearly irresistible story. Media outlets instinctively exploit this dynamic. For Harry and Meghan, the stakes were immediate. Every report, every tweet, every headline carried potential consequences. Legal teams, PR advisors, and family members likely monitored coverage obsessively, analyzing tone, reach, and potential impact. Each rumor, each narrative, had to be countered, mitigated, or strategically ignored. One strategy often employed in high-profile crises is the controlled narrative, releasing partial information to redirect speculation or delay exposure. But in this case, the alleged yacht photos were out of their hands. Whispers and rumors propagated faster than statements could be issued. Montecito's quiet, intended to shield, paradoxically became the story itself. Absence was now interpreted as guilt, fear, or secrecy.